Some cars were bad, some were dangerous. But these 11 were so disastrously engineered that regulators, insurers, and even manufacturers themselves said the same thing. Shut it down. Their stories end not with glory, but with recalls, lawsuits, crushed prototypes, and reputations burned to ash.
Please support us and subscribe to the channel. Thank you.
1973 Pontiac GTO Colonnade, the muscle car that forgot how to flex. In the great saga of American muscle cars, few stories sting as sharply as the fall of the Pontiac GTO. The original GTO of 1964 practically invented the muscle car formula. For years, it dominated streets, drag strips, and teenagers' bedroom posters. But by 1973, the tides of regulation, insurance crackdowns, and corporate caution had washed away the thunder. And the final blow came when Pontiac unveiled the 1973 GTO, an emissions-choked, overweight colony body disappointment that fans still refer to, half-jokingly, as the GTO in name only. The 1973 GTO was the first of the Colonnade-era A-bodies, a new generation of GM midsize cars designed more for safety and crash standards than performance. This was the first GTO ever forced to wear mandated 5-mile-per-hour bumpers, huge chrome railroad beams that jutted from the body like scaffolding. And underneath that bloated new exterior sat an even bigger problem. The once mighty GTO no longer had the heart of a muscle car. Gone were the savage 400s and screaming 455 HOs that had made earlier GTOs legend. In their place, Pontiac installed a detuned, low-compression 400 V8, producing a sad, asthmatic 230 horsepower, or even worse, the base 400 with just 200 horsepower. The optional 455 V8 existed on paper, but it wasn't the tire-killing monster fans wanted. Choked by emissions controls, restricted exhaust, and conservative timing, it made noise, but not speed. Torque was there, but excitement wasn't. This wasn't a phoenix rising. This was a phoenix stumbling. For GTO loyalists, the betrayal was visceral. The car was heavier, slower, softer, and wrapped in styling that prioritized government regulations over performance swagger. The Colonnade body was controversial from the start. Wide, bulky, and more formal than aggressive. The long hood and short deck were technically intact, but the proportions had shifted. Where previous GTOs looked ready to attack, the 73 model looked ready to take your grandparents to brunch. Then there was the weight. The new body structure, bigger bumpers, increased sound insulation, and luxury features meant the 1973 GTO was packing on mass like a retired prizefighter. Depending on equipment, it tipped the scales near 4,000 pounds, hundreds more than the original GTO had ever carried. That extra girth dulled the acceleration, softened the handling, and pushed the limits of brakes already compromised by the era's engineering limitations. When the magazines tested it, the results were brutal. A 0 to 60 time in the 8 to 9 second range, numbers that would have embarrassed the base model GTO from a decade earlier, was now somehow acceptable. The quarter mile? Somewhere in the mid-15s to high 16s. Not catastrophic, but far from the muscle car glory Pontiac was advertising. Even the marketing sounded unsure. Pontiac kind of spinned the 1973 GTO as a more refined and modernized version of the classic. Ads boasted about handling, interior comfort, and the new Colonnade structure. But enthusiasts weren't buying it. They wanted a legend, not a compromise. They wanted a street warrior, not a regulation-friendly cruiser. Inside, the GTO was a mixed bag. The interior quality was decent for the mid-1970s, with comfortable seats and a tidy dashboard. But nothing inside felt performance-oriented. The bucket seats were soft and spongy, the gauges were limited, and no matter how hard Pontiac tried to dress it up with decals and badges, the cabin betrayed the truth. This was a Le Mans with sporty trim, not a true GTO reborn. Enthusiasts didn't just grumble, they revolted. Letters poured into magazines, dealers heard constant complaints, car clubs mocked the model. The GTO badge had been stapled onto a car that no longer embodied the spirit of wide-open American horsepower. Even Pontiac executives admitted the 1973 model wasn't what the GTO name deserved. Sales reflected the disappointment. Fewer than 5,000 units were built, pathetic compared to the six-figure numbers the GTO pulled at its peak. And Pontiac got the message loud and clear. The 1973 GTO Colonnade was a one-year-only experiment, quickly buried and quietly pushed aside. In 1974, they tried again, this time on the Ventura platform, but even that version lacked the fire of the original. The decline continued until the nameplate vanished entirely after 1974. It's easy to view the 1973 GTO Colonnade as a failure, and in the performance sense, it undoubtedly was. But the car also symbolizes something bigger, the collapse of the muscle car era. The GTO wasn't alone. Every automaker was scrambling to adapt to emissions regulations, rising insurance rates, the oil crisis, and changing consumer tastes. GM, Ford, and Chrysler all neutered their performance cars. But because the GTO was one of the original muscle car heroes, its fall felt more tragic, like watching a heavyweight champion forced to compete with his hands tied. In hindsight, the 1973 Pontiac GTO Colonnade stands as a cautionary tale, a warning about what happens when an automaker clings to a legendary name without delivering the spirit behind it. It wasn't a bad car for its time. As a mid-size cruiser, it was competent, comfortable, and reliably built. But as a GTO, it was a ghost, a shell, a badge searching for an identity. You can call it interesting, you can call it obscure, but rare? Yes. Revered? Not quite. It's rare for the same reason catastrophes are rare, because they happen once and never again.
1958 Ford Skyliner Retractable, the brilliant, impossible machine that broke itself. In the long history of American automotive excess, few machines embody both genius and insanity, quite like the 1958 Ford Skyliner Retractable. For 3 short years, 1957, 1958, and 1959, Ford produced one of the most mechanically complex convertibles ever to hit the American road. It was part car, part circus stunt, part engineering experiment, and part sales floor spectacle. The idea alone was outrageous. A full steel hardtop that folded itself into the trunk with the push of a button. No fabric roof, no manual latches, just a metal roof vanishing into the rear deck like a magic trick. But behind that magic was something far less glamorous. 10 electric motors, 7 relays, 610 feet of wiring, 10 solenoids, 4 locking mechanisms, and dozens of switches, all working in precarious harmony. It wasn't a car. It wasn't a convertible. It was a mechanical Rube Goldberg machine cruising at 60 miles per hour. And the engineering complexity was so absurd, so delicate, so utterly impractical that Ford eventually shut the whole program down, not because the idea was bad, but because the reality was nearly impossible. To understand the Skyliner's problem, you have to picture what Ford was trying to do. This wasn't a compact roadster. It wasn't a lightweight convertible. The Skyliner was a gigantic 1950s American full-size car, long, wide, heavy, drenched in chrome, and shaped like a locomotive wearing tail fins. To make a hardtop fold itself into the trunk, Ford engineers had to essentially redesign half the car. The trunk wasn't a trunk anymore. It became a storage bay, a mechanical cave filled with gears, arms, hinges, wiring bundles, and motors stacked like organs in a robot. The actual storage space left for luggage, barely enough for a suitcase. The roof operation was a symphony that required everything to happen in perfect order. Deck lid opens backward. Roof unlatches. Roof folds. Motors pull it into the trunk. Deck lid closes. Latches re-engage. Dozens of switches confirm positions. If one switch failed, the whole thing froze. If one motor under-delivered, the roof jammed. If one piece of wiring corroded, the car locked itself into mechanical limbo. Today, a single automatic roof mechanism might rely on a central computer. The Skyliner had 600-plus feet of wires instead of a microchip. Everything was done through brute force electrics and mechanical sequencing. Owners of the day learned very quickly. You didn't just put down the top on a Skyliner, you risked it. You hoped nothing snapped, burned out, or tangled. A casual roof operation at the beach parking lot could turn into a 5-hour ordeal involving a repair shop, a service manual, and a prayer. Dealers dreaded these cars. Mechanics cursed them. And Ford's warranty department practically needed its own budget to cover all the roof problems. Roofs stuck halfway open. Decklets jammed or refused to unlock. Motors burned out from strain. Switches failed without warning. Wiring corroded and created electrical ghosts. The roof would start moving, then stop, then reverse, then stop again. Ford famously had to train dealership mechanics with special classes just to fix the Skyliner's top. Even then, repairs were a nightmare. Diagnosing a failed retractable roof meant checking relays, switches, limit sensors, and wiring one by one. A single loose connector could disable the entire system. Too heavy, too expensive, too late. The 1958 model year made things even worse. America was falling into recession, and the entire auto market tightened. Ford changed the roof design slightly, added more styling weight, and raised costs. The car ballooned past 4,000 pounds, an elephant with retractable tricks. Fuel economy, terrible. Trump space, laughable. Reliability, a gamble. Cost, higher than most buyers were willing to pay for a mechanical headache. 1957, strong launch, curiosity. 1958, economic downturn plus mechanical reputation equals collapse. 1959, Ford quietly prepared the funeral. By 1960, the retractable was gone, abandoned as a fascinating but doomed experiment. A convertible without a country. Part of the Skyliner's downfall was its identity crisis. Who exactly was it for? Traditional convertible lovers preferred simple cloth tops. Luxury buyers wanted smoothness, not a machine that clicked and whirred like a factory conveyor. Performance buyers saw the extra weight and ran. Family buyers wanted a trunk, not a mechanical cave tacked with electrical spaghetti. Ford had created something spectacular, but something with no natural audience. It was the world's first production retractable hardtop, and almost the last, because it proved how difficult the concept was with 1950s technology. It was too advanced for its time, like a smartphone invented in 1910. The system that broke the company's patience. As failures mounted and warranty claims rolled in, Ford realized the harsh truth. The retractable system was too complicated to survive in mass production. The cost of manufacturing, repairing, and supporting it outweighed any benefit. Even the customers who loved the Skyliner admired it the way you admire a bomb disposal robot. Fascinated, but nervous every time it moves. So, Ford shut the program down. The engineers who spent years perfecting the retractable system could only watch their masterpiece be buried, its brilliance overshadowed by the sheer insanity of putting that much complexity into a car for average Americans. Modern collectors adore the Skyliner retractable, but they adore it the same way we adore old steam-powered machinery. Beautiful, ingenious, and best admired from a safe distance. Owners today still fear the roof. Many cars have had their entire wiring systems replaced. Some roofs are operated only once a year at shows to avoid stressing components older than most of the people watching. And most importantly, everyone who sees it understands exactly why Ford stopped building them. The 1958 Ford Skyliner was a marvel, a miracle, a mechanical spectacle, and a disaster. It represented the peak of 1950s optimism, the belief that anything could be electrified, automated, mechanized, and made dramatic. But it also represented the crash of reality, The moment when engineering said, enough. The Skyliner retractable was mechanically impossible, but Ford built it anyway. And in doing so, it gave the world one of the most unforgettable automotive experiments ever to hit the road. Equal parts genius and madness, brilliance and chaos, innovation and self-destruction. A car that lived loudly, failed beautifully, and left behind a legacy of wonder and warning.
The 1934 Chrysler Airflow stands today as one of the most fascinating paradoxes in American automotive history. A vehicle that was simultaneously a catastrophic market failure and a visionary masterpiece decades ahead of the industry. At its launch, the Airflow represented a radical departure from everything American drivers expected, wanted, or were prepared to accept. It was aerodynamic in an era obsessed with chrome excess, scientifically engineered at a time when most cars were designed with a ruler and a guess, and safety-focused long before the word safety ever appeared in a sales brochure. The Airflow was a revolution, and revolutions rarely arrive quietly. Instead, it crashed spectacularly, dragging Chrysler's reputation and sales down with it. Only generations later would the Airflow be recognized not as an embarrassment, but as a blueprint for the future. To understand the Airflow's shocking failure, one must first understand what a radical act it was in 1934. While the rest of the American auto industry was still producing cars with upright windshields, tall brick-like grilles, and bodies that looked like rolling sheds, Chrysler dared to redesign the automobile from scratch using wind tunnel science. Working with renowned aerodynamicist Orville Wright, Chrysler engineers spent years testing airflow characteristics, crafting a streamlined body that minimized drag and improved stability. It was the first American car whose shape wasn't dictated by style or fashion, but by physics. The rounded nose, waterfall grille, tapered rear, and integrated headlights were alien to the public. Customers wanted tradition. Chrysler delivered innovation. The public recoiled. The engineering breakthroughs of the Airflow were equally radical. It was built using a semi-unitized body structure, which distributed weight more evenly and dramatically increased rigidity. The engine sat further forward over the front axle, another first, in order to balance weight and improve handling. Passengers were positioned between the axles rather than on top of them, making the ride smoother and safer. In crash tests, Airflow survived impacts that left conventional cars mangled beyond recognition. Chrysler didn't just build a new kind of car, they built a better car, using objective data and engineering rigor. But while the Airflow was a triumph of science, it was a tragedy of timing and perception. The American public, battered by the Great Depression, didn't want bold experiments or futuristic statements. They wanted familiarity, predictability, and something that looked like the cars they had always known. When they first saw the Airflow's rounded, almost insect-like shape, many recoiled. It didn't look powerful or prestigious. It didn't look expensive. It didn't even look American. Rumors spread that the car was unsafe, completely ignoring that it was actually the safest car of its time. This was a new, uncomfortable idea. A car designed properly, not stylistically. People weren't ready. Dealers panicked first. Many didn't want to stock the Airflow, let alone promote it. Customers wandered into showrooms, stared at the strange aerodynamic shape, and walked straight out. Sales plummeted. Competitors, while privately impressed and alarmed by Chrysler's innovation, mocked the design publicly. Critics joked that the Airflow looked like it had been melted in the sun or rolled downhill before the paint dried. Buyers laughed and didn't buy. To make matters worse, early production issues further damaged the Airflow's public image. Some cars suffered structural problems due to early miscalculations in the brand new assembly process. Though these issues were quickly corrected, the damage was already done. American buyers in the 1930s were unforgiving, especially towards anything unfamiliar. Once the Airflow was labeled a failure, no amount of engineering brilliance could save it. By 1937, Chrysler surrendered. The Airflow was discontinued with sales figures so low they embarrassed the company. Chrysler retreated to more conservative designs almost immediately, abandoning the future they had attempted to build. What could have been Chrysler's proudest achievement became a symbol of overreach and misplaced ambition. For decades afterward, the Airflow was remembered as a cautionary tale, proof that being too far ahead of your time is indistinguishable from being wrong. Yet today, the Chrysler Airflow is regarded as a masterpiece. Historians, designers, and engineers view it as the moment American automotive design truly entered the modern era. Many of the features that once doomed it, streamlined shape, unitized construction, safety-oriented engineering, became industry standards. Every aerodynamic car built today owes a debt to the Airflow. Its influence is seen not just in Chrysler's own later designs, but in the entire industry's gradual realization that efficiency and engineering mattered. In hindsight, the Airflow's failure was not due to flawed design, it was due to flawed timing. It asked too much of a public that wasn't ready to abandon the past. But as often happens, time redeemed it. What was once mocked is now celebrated. What once failed is now studied. The Airflow died in shame, but rose in legend. The 1934 Chrysler Airflow stands as a reminder that great ideas often arrive before their audience, and that sometimes the world needs decades to understand brilliance when it first appears. By 1987, the Pontiac Fiero GT should have been a triumphant redemption story. It had the styling of a mini exotic, a mid-engine layout unheard of in its price class, and finally, the mechanical improvements that should have made it a legitimate sports car. But the Fiero was carrying a curse, one forged not by performance shortcomings or lack of engineering ambition, but by flames. Literal flames. The early Fieros of 1984 and 1985 became infamous for catching fire spontaneously, sometimes while idling at a stoplight, sometimes while cruising down the highway. Newspaper headlines mocked them, comedians joked about them, and every owner feared being turned into the punchline of an automotive horror story. By the time Pontiac got things right, the car's reputation was already ashes. The 1987 Pontiac Fiero GT arrived after years of painful lessons. GM had finally approved real investment into the model, better suspension, better engines, and better build quality. For the first time, Pontiac's engineers were allowed to transform the Fiero into what they had originally intended, a lightweight, sharp-handling, mid-engine performance coupe. In 1984, the Fiero was more of an economy commuter with flashy styling. By 87, it was something real, something serious, something enthusiasts could be proud of. But all the engineering improvements in the world couldn't extinguish the fires of public memory. To understand why the 1987 GT never stood a chance, you have to revisit the disaster that started it all. In the early years, GM forced Pontiac to use the 2.5-liter Iron Duke four-cylinder, an old, coarse agricultural power plant that simply wasn't designed for a mid-engine environment. Combine this with a tiny oil capacity, poorly designed connecting rods, and a cramped engine bay that baked components alive, and you had a perfect recipe for self-destruction. Engines blew apart, oil leaked onto hot surfaces, cars ignited. It got so bad that an infamous report tallied more than 200 case files of Fieros catching fire during the first few years. Whether the number was exaggerated or not, the public believed it, and that belief became permanent. Pontiac tried to fight the problem. Recalls were issued, engines were redesigned, owners were reassured, but the damage was permanent. The phrase Fiero fire became a cultural punchline. Instead of being celebrated as America's first affordable mid-engine sports car, the Fiero became the car that set itself on fire while its owner was paying for gas. Now imagine trying to relaunch that car after such a PR apocalypse. The 1987 Fiero GT was, ironically, the best version of the car Pontiac had ever produced up to that point. It had the 2.8-liter V6, a real engine, one capable of giving the car respectable acceleration. The suspension was upgraded with lessons borrowed from GM's corporate sports car development. The styling was sleek with flying buttress rear windows, lower body cladding, and a mini Ferrari stance that turned heads. Inside, quality improved, reliability improved. The car finally felt engineered, not compromised. But none of that mattered, because Pontiac couldn't outrun the flames of the past. Even though the 87 GT no longer suffered from the catastrophic oiling and detonation issues of the early models, the legend of the Flaming Fiero continued to grow with every retelling. Owners who had never experienced a single mechanical issue still heard jokes at gas stations. Dealers struggled to move the cars off lots. Insurance companies, infamously ruthless in assessing risk, kept premiums high simply because the Fiero's name was on the paperwork. GM, staring at a shrinking budget and a legal minefield, decided the car wasn't worth saving. The Fiero had become a liability, not a halo. Management feared that even if the fires were truly gone, the lawsuits wouldn't be. And in an era rocked by safety paranoia and consumer activism, GM preferred to cut losses rather than risk another round of public relations inferno. By 1988, just one model year after the improved 1987 GT, the Fiero program was quietly killed, right as it was finally becoming the car it was meant to be from day one. When Pontiac discontinued the Fiero, they left behind an unusual legacy. A car that was terrible at first, then good, then excellent, but doomed all the same. The 1987 GT stands as the model caught in the middle of that paradox. It wasn't the unreliable mess of the early years, nor was it the final fully refined masterpiece of 1988. It was the penultimate, transitional model, a car that deserved applause, but received only suspicion. This is what makes the Fiero one of the saddest stories in American automotive history. The engineers who championed the car were fighting against corporate cost-cutting, public ridicule, and a disastrous early reputation. They were finally winning, but GM decided victory was no longer worth pursuing. A car once marketed as a bold new future became a cautionary tale, a reminder of how quickly a reputation can ignite and how slowly it can be extinguished. Today, enthusiasts look back at the 1987 Pontiac Fiero GT with a mixture of admiration and frustration. Admiration because it was bold, innovative, and genuinely fun to drive. Frustration because they'd arrived too late to save a car that should have been revolutionary. The Fiero tried to rise from the ashes, but the ashes were too deep. In the end, the 1987 Pontiac Fiero GT was not banned by regulators, nor by engineering failures of its own. It was banned by the unforgiving court of public opinion, a court that never forgets the scent of smoke. In the long and colorful history of American automotive failures, few names carry as much weight or as much ridicule as the Edsel. And among all the tragic entries under that ill-fated banner, the 1959 Edsel Corsair stands out as the final, stumbling step toward the cliff. It was the car that confirmed what the public already suspected: the Edsel brand had no future. Ugly styling, inconsistent mechanical quality, and a price tag that seemed delusional during a recession all combined into one spectacular corporate disaster. Ford didn't just discontinue Edsel, they scrubbed it from memory, as if hoping history would forget the automotive embarrassment entirely. To understand the 1959 Edsel Corsair, you must first understand the desperation behind it. In 1958, Ford introduced the Edsel line as a futuristic, aspirational brand slotted between Ford and Mercury. The idea was simple: cash in on the booming mid-level market and take a bite out of General Motors' Oldsmobile and Buick customers. The idea looked brilliant on paper, but only there. The launch coincided with a massive economic recession that devastated mid-price car sales. Consumers tightened their wallets. They wanted smaller, cheaper, more fuel-efficient cars, none of which the Edsel lineup offered. Then there was the styling. The first-year Edsels were mocked relentlessly for their vertical horse-collar grille, which critics compared to everything from a mailbox to, infamously, a toilet seat. Whether fair or not, the joke took hold, and the Edsel became the punchline of its own marketing campaign. Ford spent millions hyping the car, promising the most advanced automotive experience of its time. What buyers got instead was a series of mechanical failures, quality control disasters, and design choices that felt either strange or outright ugly. The 1959 Edsel Corsair was supposed to fix those problems. Instead, it proved that the brand's fate was sealed. By 1959, Ford had already panicked. The company slashed Edsel's model count, cut budgets, and tried to restyle the cars to be more conventional. The Corsair, once the premium model, was downgraded and built on the cheaper Ford Fairlane platform rather than the Mercury chassis used the previous year. This immediately diluted whatever prestige the name once had. The 1959 grille, while less bizarre than the 1958's, still looked awkward and forced, retaining the Edsel theme but losing any sense of cohesive design. It gave the Corsair the unfortunate appearance of a car trying desperately to look normal, but failing. Mechanically, the car didn't improve things either. Quality control issues persisted, from faulty electrical systems to inconsistent assembly between factories. Reports of cars delivered with mismatched parts, leaking gaskets, or malfunctioning push-button transmission selectors continued to circulate. Even though the Corsair wasn't uniquely unreliable compared to other late 50s American cars, the Edsel's reputation magnified every flaw. When people expect a car to be bad, every tiny failure becomes another nail in the coffin. But the real killer was price. At a time when buyers were fleeing to inexpensive, fuel-efficient compacts, the Corsair asked them to open their wallets even wider. It was priced like a near-luxury machine, yet delivered the driving experience and build quality of a mid-level Ford with extra chrome. People weren't just unimpressed, they were offended. Every dollar spent on a Corsair felt like a dollar wasted on a car that couldn't justify its existence. As sales collapsed, ridicule exploded. Newspapers mocked the Edsel. TV comedians ripped into it regularly. Cartoonists drew it as a mechanical buffoon. It became the metaphor for corporate incompetence. Ford reacted by going into emergency mode. After hemorrhaging hundreds of millions of dollars, nearly $3 billion in modern money, they decided enough was enough. In late 1959, just weeks after the new Corsairs hit showrooms, Ford announced that the Edsel line was dead. Dealers were furious. Owners felt abandoned. Cars sat unsold, some for years. Ford destroyed remaining inventory, dismantled production lines, and rewrote marketing history to imply Edsel never existed. It became the automotive equivalent of a family secret no one talks about. The 1959 Edsel Corsair became the symbol of that failure, not because it was the worst Edsel, but because it was the car that made it clear the brand could not be saved. It was desperate, watered down, overpriced, and laughably out of touch with what Americans wanted. It failed not only because of what it was, but because of what the name Edsel had already come to represent: a broken promise wrapped in chrome. Today, the Corsair has found a second life in car culture, not as a respected classic, but as a lesson. It reminds automakers what happens when you misread the market, underestimate the power of public perception, and attempt to fix a broken brand with half measures. Enthusiasts admire the tragedy of it. Collectors embrace the rarity, and historians acknowledge the cruel irony. Had Ford launched Edsel even a few years earlier or later, it might have succeeded. Instead, the 1959 Edsel Corsair wore the burden of a doomed name until the very end. It didn't just fail, it took an entire brand with it, leaving behind one of the most infamous cautionary tales in American automotive history. In the world of American motorsport legends, the 1969 Ford Torino Talladega hold an almost mythical status. It became one of the greatest NASCAR era warriors, a purpose-built machine designed for one thing and one thing only: winning on the high-bank superspeedways of the American South. But long before the Talladega stunned fans on the track, it terrified the very people who were supposed to test it. The earliest 1968 Aero prototypes, built as Ford's first attempt to counter Chrysler's aerodynamic dominance, were so unstable, so violent, and so genuinely dangerous at racing speeds that Ford's own factory drivers refused to continue testing them. These prototypes weren't just flawed, they were life-threatening. The story begins with NASCAR's quickly escalating aerodynamic arms race. In 1968, Dodge and Plymouth had discovered something crucial. Speed was now determined by the wind as much as by horsepower. Their slippery Charger 500s and later the Daytona were cutting through the air more efficiently than Ford's conventional fastbacks. Ford had a problem. Even with powerful 427 V8s, their cars were getting outclassed on the superspeedways of Daytona, Atlanta, and Talladega. If Ford wanted to stay competitive, they needed a revolutionary solution. A radical body redesign was no longer optional, it was mandatory. So Ford engineers went to work on the Torino, their mid-sized platform with a fastback roofline. On paper, the Torino was already fairly aerodynamic, but not enough to keep up with Mopar's advances. Early in 1968, engineers began experimenting with what they called aero mule prototypes, hand-built experimental cars with modified noses, sealed bumpers, revised rocker panels, and extended front fascia designs. These were crude, experimental, and often dangerous in ways no one expected. When test drivers first took these prototypes onto Ford's high-speed oval in Romeo, Michigan, the problems became immediately obvious. The modified noses created lift, massive lift. At speeds above 150 miles per hour, the front end of the car began to float like the beginning of an airplane takeoff. Steering inputs became vague, delayed, and sometimes completely ineffective. Drivers reported the same terrifying sensation. The car felt like it was no longer touching the track. Instead of slicing through the air, the prototype wanted to fly. Worse, the instability wasn't consistent or predictable. One pass might feel just barely manageable, the next could send the car darting unexpectedly, the rear end breaking loose without warning. High-speed corners were especially frightening. Drivers described the sensation of the car shifting under them, as if the entire chassis had disconnected from the pavement. These were not merely bad handling characteristics, they were lethal at NASCAR-level speeds. Ford's drivers, including seasoned veterans accustomed to the dangers of the era, finally reached a collective conclusion. These prototypes were not safe to test at full speed. Multiple accounts describe drivers stepping out of the cars, refusing to get back in until engineering changes were made. Ford took the warning seriously. They quietly banned continued high-speed testing of the earliest versions. Engineers returned to the drawing board, this time with a clearer sense of what not to do. The core issue was aerodynamic imbalance. The extended nose improved airflow in theory, but the angles, curvature, and panel transitions were crude and imprecise. The airflow detached, creating turbulence instead of stability. The prototypes had accidentally become giant, unstable wings, exactly the opposite of what Ford needed. This failure became the catalyst for one of Ford's smartest decisions, bringing in dedicated aerodynamic specialists. Ford's engineering staff began working more closely with wind tunnel data, not just raw intuition. The result was a complete redesign of the aero package that would transform the unstable monster into the legend known today as the Torino Talladega. The production spec Talladega received a smooth tapered nose that was not only longer but also reshaped to keep the air flowing cleanly over the car. The front bumper, crafted from actual Ford Torino rear bumpers, was rotated and blended into the body to minimize drag. The rocker panels were lowered to reduce the amount of air traveling under the car, improving downforce and stability. The rear end and greenhouse were left mostly intact, but Ford ensured that the entire aero package worked as a cohesive system rather than a collection of experimental ideas. When the finalized Talladega prototypes returned to the proving grounds, the transformation was dramatic. What had once been violent, unpredictable, and terrifying became planted, smooth, and controllable at speeds exceeding 180 miles per hour. Ford drivers who had sworn off the earlier cars now trusted the redesigned Talladega enough to push it to its limits. And those limits were exactly what Ford needed to reclaim NASCAR glory. The car dominated the 1969 season, winning the Manufacturers' Championship and establishing Ford as the team to beat. But the success of the production Talladega only highlights how close Ford came to catastrophe with its early aero attempts. Had the company ignored the warnings of its test drivers, or had they rushed an unsafe design into competition, NASCAR's history might have included tragedy instead of triumph. Today, the story of the 1968 prototypes isn't widely known outside hardcore racing historians, but it remains one of the most fascinating chapters in Ford's performance legacy. It reminds us that innovation often involves failure, and sometimes those failures are dramatic enough to scare even professional test drivers into refusing the wheel. The Talladega we celebrate today, a sleek, stable, wind-cheating powerhouse, was born directly from a series of terrifying missteps. The 1968 prototypes were too fast for comfort, too unstable for racing, and too dangerous to ignore. And without them, the legendary Torino Talladega might never have existed.
The late 1930s were an unusually turbulent time for the American auto industry. The Great Depression still cast a long shadow over consumer spending, and car makers were walking a delicate tightrope between innovation and survival. Buyers wanted reliability, affordability, and practicality. Anything even slightly extravagant was a risky gamble. Into this fragile landscape stepped one of the boldest, strangest, and most visually aggressive cars of the decade, the 1938 Graham Spirit of Motion, also known, less flatteringly, as the Shark Nose. It was a car born from ambition and desperation. Graham Page, a small independent automaker struggling to stay afloat, needed a miracle. By 1937, the company was sliding toward bankruptcy, crowded out by the Big Three and hammered by shrinking sales. To save the brand, Graham needed a showstopper, something revolutionary, unforgettable, and capable of drawing customers away from Ford, Chevrolet, and Chrysler. So they turned to the man who had just helped design one of the decade's greatest successes, Amos Northup. Northup was an aerodynamic design pioneer, known for his dramatic, streamlined visions. He believed that the future of the automobile lay in sculpted forms inspired by aircraft and natural flow. For the Graham assignment, he pushed the concept further than any American manufacturer had ever dared. The result was the 1938 Spirit of Motion, a car that looked simultaneously beautiful, terrifying, and completely out of sync with its era. The car's front end was its defining feature, a fierce prow that extended downward and outward, creating a sharp, predatory stance. The vertical grille slanted forward like the snout of a shark bursting through water, earning the car its enduring nickname. The fenders flowed in a continuous, unbroken arc into the body, creating a sense of movement even when the car was parked. The headlights were recessed behind glass covers, the hood dipped dramatically, and the entire front half of the car seemed to lean into the future like a charging machine. It was unlike anything America had seen, and that was its downfall. Buyers of the late 1930s were not prepared for such radical design language. The United States was still recovering financially, and consumers tended to prefer conservative, safe styling. Most car buyers didn't want to make a futuristic fashion statement. They wanted something familiar that projected stability, modesty, and respectability. In that cultural climate, the Graham Spirit of Motion was perceived not as innovative, but bizarre, risky, and even unsettling. Dealers quickly realized they had a problem. Potential customers stopped to stare, but very few were willing to buy. Some found the car grotesque. Others thought it looked aggressive or evil. Many simply found it too strange. And when you're trying to sell a car during a depression, strange is deadly. Even worse, the styling overshadowed what Graham actually did well, the engineering. The Spirit of Motion was available with both conventional and supercharged engines, and the supercharged version produced lively performance for its day. The car rode well, handled competently, and boasted an advanced chassis. But none of that mattered when the styling alienated the very customers the company needed to survive. To make matters worse, tragedy struck during development. Amos Northup died in 1937, before the car even reached production. Without his visionary designer to guide refinement, Graham was left with a bold concept that lacked the subtle adjustments needed to soften its impact. The styling that Northup might have evolved became frozen in its most extreme form. When the Graham Spirit of Motion hit showrooms in 1938, the public reaction was immediate and devastating. Sales collapsed almost instantly. Instead of revitalizing the brand, the car accelerated its decline. Dealers struggled to move inventory. Customers walked past with raised eyebrows. Newspapers and critics mocked the design. Some buyers joked that the car looked like it wanted to bite the road. The car's dramatic flowing form may now be admired by modern collectors, but at the time, it was seen as a surreal mistake. In truth, the market didn't literally ban the Spirit of Motion, but it did something worse. It ignored it. Indifference in the auto industry is fatal. Within 1 year, Graham pulled the model from production in humiliation. The company limped along with the last of its resources until shutting down its consumer automobile operations shortly after. Yet history has a way of reshaping failures into curiosities and sometimes into legends. Today, the 1938 Graham Spirit of Motion is regarded as a masterpiece of pre-war automotive design. Collectors prize it for the very attributes that doomed it in 1938, its flowing fenders, radical angles, and audacious form. What the Depression-era public rejected as too futuristic is now recognized as one of the most original American car designs of the 20th century. But no amount of historical appreciation can change what happened in its own time. The Spirit of Motion stands as a stark reminder of how risky it is to be ahead of your era. It is a car banned by the market, not through regulation, scandal, or mechanical catastrophe, but by the simple fact that it dared to be too different at a moment when buyers wanted anything but different. In one bold leap, Graham bet everything on a futuristic design. The market responded with silence, and that silence was the end.
Few cars in American history have ignited as much controversy as the 1960 Chevrolet Corvair. Launched as GM's bold answer to the rising popularity of compact European cars like the Volkswagen Beetle, the Corvair promised innovation, efficiency, and a touch of flair. But beneath its clean lines and air-cooled engineering lurked a danger that would make it infamous: lift-off oversteer and an unsettling propensity to roll over. The Corvair became the poster child for automotive negligence, not through legislation, recall, or outright banning, but through public fear and moral outrage. A car banned without paperwork in the minds of millions. The Corvair was conceived in the late 1950s when Chevrolet noticed a shift in consumer demand. Compact, fuel-efficient vehicles from Europe were slowly carving out a niche in the American market. GM executives determined to keep Chevrolet relevant embarked on a radical engineering experiment. The result was a rear-engine air-cooled car, a stark departure from the front-engine water-cooled sedans that dominated Detroit at the time. This layout was reminiscent of the Volkswagen Beetle, but Chevrolet wanted to blend European compact efficiency with American styling and performance. From a technical standpoint, the Corvair was impressive. Its flat-six air-cooled engine sat in the rear, freeing up interior space and reducing front-end weight. The suspension was independent all around, a forward-thinking feature in 1960. GM touted it as a car that combined the efficiency of a European compact with the comfort and size expected by American families. On paper, it was a marvel. On the road, it was something else entirely. The first problem emerged with the rear suspension and handling dynamics. Early Corvairs employed a swing-axle rear suspension, a design that was cheap, simple, and light. But swing axles have a fatal flaw. Under sudden deceleration or liftoff conditions, the rear wheels could tuck under the car, causing severe oversteer. In layman's terms, lifting your foot off the accelerator in a corner could make the car snap violently, rotating the rear end outward. At higher speeds, this behavior could easily escalate into a full rollover. Chevrolet initially underestimated the risk. Internal tests suggested that the car's handling was within acceptable limits, but these tests were conducted by trained engineers on controlled tracks, not average drivers on everyday roads. Real-world conditions were harsher, and consumers quickly reported terrifying incidents. Stories circulated of cars spinning out of control, sometimes resulting in serious accidents. The media began to pay attention, and the Corvair's reputation as a dangerous car started to take root. The controversy reached its apex in 1965, when Ralph Nader published Unsafe at Any Speed, a book that accused American automakers of prioritizing style, power, and profit over safety. The first-generation swing-axle Corvair became the poster child for Nader's argument. He meticulously documented cases of liftoff oversteer, rollovers, and engineering oversights. Though GM disputed Nader's claims, the book captured the public imagination. Suddenly, the Corvair was more than a car. It was a symbol of corporate negligence and regulatory failure.
Chevrolet responded by redesigning the Corvair for 1965. The second generation featured a fully independent rear suspension with semi-trailing arms, dramatically reducing the risk of lift-off oversteer. Handling improved, and the car became significantly safer. However, the damage to its reputation was already done. Sales plummeted as families shied away from a vehicle that the media and safety advocates had demonized. The Corvair became the car that everyone remembered for its potential danger, not for its innovation or design. Interestingly, the Corvair was never officially banned in any legal sense. There was no government mandate that prohibited its sale or forced a recall. Instead, it was socially and morally banned. Public opinion, fear, and regulatory scrutiny effectively kept it out of garages across America. Parents refused to buy it, used car buyers avoided it, and insurance companies began pricing it as a high-risk vehicle. The swing-axle Corvair became the poster child for how a car could be taken off the road through public perception alone. From a modern perspective, the controversy is both fascinating and cautionary. The Corvair was a technically advanced vehicle for its time. Air-cooled engines, independent suspension, and compact efficiency were forward-thinking features. Yet a fundamental misunderstanding of real-world dynamics turned innovation into liability. It highlights a crucial lesson in automotive engineering. Brilliance on paper does not equal safety in practice. Designers and executives must account for the average driver, not just the ideal test conditions. The Corvair's legacy lives on. It inspired stronger safety regulations, including the eventual creation of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, NHTSA. It serves as a warning to automakers about underestimating public perception and overestimating driver skill. Enthusiasts still admire it for its design, handling once upgraded, and uniqueness. But the first-generation swing-axle cars remain cautionary symbols of what can happen when innovation outpaces safe engineering. In conclusion, the 1960 Chevrolet Corvair occupies a unique place in automotive history. It was innovative, efficient, and stylish, yet simultaneously notorious for its hidden dangers. Liftoff oversteer, rollovers, and the public outcry made it too dangerous to govern in the eyes of American society. Banned not by legislation, but by fear, it became a lesson in the importance of engineering, perception, and the delicate balance between innovation and safety. The Corvair reminds us that even a technically brilliant vehicle can fall victim to human error, design oversights, and the unrelenting court of public opinion.
In the mid-1980s, General Motors was navigating a challenging automotive landscape. The domestic market was shifting. Buyers increasingly demanded smaller, more fuel-efficient cars without sacrificing performance. European and Japanese imports were eating into GM's compact and mid-size segments, offering nimble handling and modern turbocharged engines. In response, Chevrolet attempted to inject excitement into its mid-size lineup with the celebrity Eurosport Turbo, a car that, on paper, promised a combination of familiar American practicality and European-style performance. The Celebrity, launched in 1986, was a familiar platform. Millions of Americans knew it as a reliable, if uninspiring, front-wheel drive mid-size car with an ordinary, naturally aspirated engine. The Eurosport trim attempted to make the car sportier. Suspension tweaks, slightly stiffer handling, and cosmetic upgrades made it feel more aggressive than the base models. But Chevrolet wanted more. The engineers began experimenting with a turbocharged 2.8-liter V6, hoping to turn the Eurosport into a genuine performance variant that could compete with imported turbo sedans. The turbo prototypes were ambitious, but ambition has a price. GM engineers quickly discovered that the stock Celebrity engine bay simply could not handle the heat generated by forced induction. The 2.8-liter V6, which in naturally aspirated form had been relatively unremarkable, was pushed far beyond its design limits.
Turbochargers generate extreme temperatures, and the compact engine bay of the Eurosport lacks sufficient airflow and heat shielding. Under moderate testing, components began to overheat. Intake manifolds warped, wiring insulation melted, and hoses softened. Worse, the problem wasn't theoretical, it was catastrophic. During early prototype runs, 2 of the turbo Eurosports actually caught fire. Flames erupted in the engine compartment, consuming wiring and damaging the surrounding bodywork. Fortunately, these incidents happened on close tracks with test engineers present, preventing injuries. But the event sent a clear message. The car as it existed was fundamentally unsafe. It was a ticking time bomb, and GM realized that any attempt to bring it to market would be an absolute liability. At that point, GM executives made a decisive internal call. The celebrity Eurosport Turbo would never see production. The decision wasn't due to lack of market demand, potential profit, or insufficient performance. Those could have been fixed with time and redesign. The car was banned internally because it was inherently dangerous. The heat problems were so severe and the fire risks so pronounced that even experienced engineers could not guarantee driver safety. 2 prototypes had already burned. 1 more could have resulted in injury or death. GM destroyed the existing cars to prevent anyone from attempting to reverse engineer them or test them further. The technical failures of the Eurosport Turbo highlight how certain platforms simply cannot support radical modifications. Turbocharging an engine is not simply about bolting on a turbine and a boost controller. Modern turbo engines rely on carefully engineered cooling systems, intercooling, upgraded oil and fuel circuits, and precisely tuned ignition timing. In 1986, the Celebrity's engine bay, cooling system, and materials were inadequate for sustained turbo operation. GM's engineers learned the hard way that performance aspirations must be matched to underlying engineering reality. Beyond the technical lessons, the incident also underscores the corporate responsibility inherent in automotive design. GM could have attempted a half measure, selling the car without proper heat shielding or with reduced boost, but such a compromise would have placed consumers in direct danger. Instead, the company made the prudent, if unpopular, choice to cancel the project entirely. This decision avoided potential lawsuits, injuries, and public relations disasters. In hindsight, it also saved GM from repeating the mistakes that plagued other high-profile turbo experiments of the era, which sometimes resulted in recalls or fiery reputations. The Chevrolet Celebrity Eurosport Turbo now exists only in automotive folklore. Enthusiasts occasionally uncover references to it in engineering documents, memos, or prototype photographs, but no production cars ever made it into showrooms. Its story is a cautionary tale about the limits of platform engineering and the hidden dangers of forced induction when applied to an incompatible chassis. It also serves as a reminder of how far American automakers had yet to go in mastering turbocharging, a technology that Japanese and European manufacturers were beginning to exploit with much more consistent results. Interestingly, the car's cancellation has fueled a form of mythic status among collectors. People speculate endlessly about what the car could have been, a high-performance mid-sized turbo sedan that might have changed Chevrolet's image in the 1980s. Yet the reality remains that the prototype was unsafe beyond repair. Any surviving concept drawings or documentation only reinforce the idea that the Eurosport Turbo was too dangerous to release. It's a perfect example of ambition running up against physics, engineering limitations, and corporate responsibility. In conclusion, the 1986 Chevrolet Celebrity Eurosport Turbo was a car that promised excitement, performance, and a new direction for GM's midsize lineup. But ambition without engineering foresight proved lethal. The turbo setup overheated the engine bay, prototypes caught fire, and GM wisely banned the project internally. Destroying the cars ensured that no one could unwittingly replicate the danger. The Eurosport Turbo remains a legendary what could have been, but also a sobering lesson in automotive engineering. Sometimes the car you want to build is simply too dangerous to exist.
In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Chrysler was navigating a perilous era. The company was struggling financially, grappling with rising fuel prices, tightening emissions regulations, and the fallout from the oil crises. In the midst of this turmoil, Chrysler sought to inject some excitement into its mid-size lineup. The Dodge Murata, a two-door coupe built on the mid-size J-body platform, was already a modest attempt at creating a luxury performance vehicle to compete with GM's personal coupes like the Monte Carlo and Pontiac Grand Prix, but Chrysler's engineers, always tempted by raw horsepower, dreamed bigger. They wanted to give the Murata muscle car credibility by shoehorning in the mighty 360 cubic inch V8. What happened next would turn the project into a cautionary tale of over-ambition. The Murata CMX 360 was intended to be a halo car for Dodge, a way to lure enthusiasts with the promise of big power in a personal coupe package. The 360 V8 was a familiar engine within Chrysler's lineup, known for delivering respectable torque and reliable performance. In theory, installing it into the Murata would create a car with the kind of acceleration and highway authority that Dodge's competition lacked. Engineers speculated that the combination of the 360's grunt with the Murata's sleeker styling could produce a sleeper hit, a luxury coupe with genuine muscle. Reality, however, proved harsh. The Murata was not designed to handle the torque and vibration of a large V8. Its chassis, suspension, and frame were optimized for lighter engines, typically the inline-six and small-block V8s used in production models. When Chrysler's test team installed the 360 and subjected the prototype to normal driving and acceleration tests, the car quickly revealed its structural limitations. The immense torque stressed the subframe, the rear suspension began to deform, and under hard acceleration, the body itself twisted. In essence, the Murata's own power was actively damaging the vehicle designed to harness it. The first prototype was alarming, but still marginally drivable. Engineers attempted minor reinforcements to the frame, hoping to tame the 360's fury. However, each modification added weight and complexity, and the underlying problem remained. The chassis was fundamentally inadequate. During one particularly vigorous acceleration test, the car's frame developed noticeable cracks near the rear suspension mounts, and the floor pan began to flex excessively. The car's alignment and handling were compromised to the point where it was unsafe at highway speeds. Faced with this reality, Chrysler executives made the only responsible decision. The Murata CMX 360 project was immediately canceled. Unlike other high-performance prototypes that might have been massaged into shape with engineering tweaks, this one was doomed by its platform itself. No amount of reinforcement could compensate for a chassis that was never designed for a 360 V8's torque. Continuing the project would have been not just expensive, but potentially catastrophic if the car reached public roads. Safety, cost, and brand reputation all demanded termination. The story of the Murata CMX 360 highlights a recurring problem in the late muscle car era: the tension between marketing ambition and engineering reality. Chrysler wanted a halo vehicle to show that it could compete with GM and Ford in the personal coupe market, but the company's platforms were aging and development budgets were limited. The engineers' desire to deliver raw power clashed with the limitations of a chassis optimized for economy and moderate performance. The result was a car that literally could not survive its own engine. Interestingly, the CMX 360 prototype never reached showrooms, and very few photographs or documents of it exist. This scarcity has contributed to a kind of myth around the project. Automotive enthusiasts occasionally speculate on what could have been: a Murata capable of holding its own against the Monte Carlo SS or Pontiac Grand Prix SJ. But reality is unambiguous. The car's own power made it unsafe, unmarketable, and impossible to mass produce. Any surviving components were either scrapped
or absorbed into engineering studies for future vehicles. The Murata CMX 360 also underscores a broader lesson in automotive design. Horsepower alone does not make a good car. The balance between engine, suspension, chassis, and body is critical. A high-powered engine in an inadequately designed frame is not an upgrade, it is a liability. This lesson echoes through automotive history, from the 1960s muscle car era to modern high-performance vehicles, where engineering integration is as crucial as raw numbers on a dyno sheet. From a historical perspective, the Murata CMX 360 is emblematic of Chrysler's struggle during the late 70s and early 80s. Ambition met limitation, and financial pressures left no room for the kind of extensive redesign that would have been necessary. The car's failure was not due to lack of vision or engineering talent, but to the immutable laws of physics. No amount of marketing spin could overcome the simple truth: the chassis could not contain the engine. In conclusion, the 1980 Dodge Murata CMX 360 remains one of the most striking examples of a car defeated by its own potential. Chrysler's attempt to marry the 360 V8 with a midsize coupe chassis ended in disaster: twisted frames, unsafe handling, and an instant cancellation. The prototype became a ghost, a cautionary tale for engineers and marketers alike. The lesson is timeless. Raw power is meaningless without the structural integrity and balance to support it. The Murata CMX 360, though never seen on the streets, stands as a monument to ambition gone awry, a car that destroyed itself before it could ever be driven by the public.
The Chrysler Newport two-door of 1980 stands as a striking example of timing, market misjudgment, and corporate misfortune colliding into automotive failure. Chrysler, still reeling from the fuel crises of the late 1970s and the ongoing financial strains that threatened the company's survival, attempted to launch a full-size coupe aimed at buyers seeking traditional American luxury and style. In theory, the Newport offered comfort, spaciousness, and the kind of stately design that had once epitomized Chrysler's personal luxury vehicles. In reality, the timing and execution were catastrophic. To understand the Newport's failure, one must first consider the broader context of the American car market in 1980. Gasoline prices had skyrocketed following the 1979 oil crisis, and consumers were increasingly shifting away from massive, thirstily powered cars. Compact imports from Japan and smaller domestic sedans began dominating sales charts. Yet Chrysler, clinging to the belief that American buyers still craved big, comfortable coupes, rolled out the Newport two-door, an enormous vehicle tipping the scales at well over 4,000 pounds, with a V8 engine optimized for power rather than efficiency. The car itself was a relic of a bygone era. Its styling remained bold and stately, with long, straight lines, pronounced chrome accents, and a plush interior designed for comfort rather than sportiness. But its size, once a selling point, became a liability. Maneuvering such a car required wide streets and ample parking, which increasingly were luxuries in urban centers. Meanwhile, fuel economy, already a secondary consideration in Chrysler's design philosophy, became a primary concern for buyers who could not stomach the massive tank more than once per week. The problems extended to the dealer network. Chrysler dealerships, acutely aware of the shifting consumer preferences, were hesitant to order the Newport two-door. Sales staff knew the market was moving towards smaller, more efficient vehicles, and they were wary of being stuck with inventory that would not move. In many cases, dealers opted to stock smaller, more fuel-conscious models, effectively sabotaging the Newport's potential market penetration before it could even gain traction. The lack of dealer enthusiasm was fatal, because in the pre-internet era, dealer promotion was crucial to a car's success. Without active marketing, the Newport languished on showroom floors, unnoticed and unwanted. Early sales figures reinforced the bleak reality.
The Newport two-door, which Chrysler had hoped would compete with GM's Chevrolet Caprice or Ford's LTD2, failed to attract buyers in meaningful numbers. The car's combination of size, poor fuel economy, and a dated, heavy-handed design alienated the very audience it sought to appeal to. Even loyal Chrysler buyers balked at the thought of driving a massive coupe that guzzled gas and handled like a barge. By mid-year, Chrysler executives recognized the financial and reputational risk of continuing production. The decision to pull the Newport two-door mid-year was both practical and painful. Chrysler had already invested heavily in tooling, advertising, and initial production, but continuing would only deepen losses. Canceling the car was a rare admission of defeat, a company acknowledging that it had misread the market and that a vehicle, no matter how traditionally American or stylish, would not sell in the climate dominated by fuel concerns and consumer pragmatism. The withdrawal of the Newport was a clear signal that Chrysler's personal luxury strategy needed reevaluation. From an engineering standpoint, the Newport was competent. The suspension, steering, and build quality met Chrysler standards, and the car was comfortable for long drives. But comfort and craftsmanship could not overcome fundamental market mismatch. Buyers in 1980 were not interested in nostalgia. They were concerned about affordability, efficiency, and practicality. The Newport two-door ignored these priorities entirely. Its failure illustrates that even a well-built car can be doomed if its timing and market positioning are misaligned. Historically, the Newport two-door serves as a cautionary tale about product planning in the automotive industry. It underscores the importance of aligning vehicle design with economic conditions and consumer sentiment. The oil crises had reshaped American buying habits, and Chrysler's inability or unwillingness to fully anticipate this shift resulted in one of the shortest-lived models of the era. Its mid-year cancellation demonstrates that automotive companies must remain agile, willing to abandon even high-investment projects when market realities render them unviable. Collectors today view the 1980 Newport two-door with curiosity. Its scarcity, caused not by desirability but by its abrupt withdrawal, makes it a minor curiosity among Chrysler enthusiasts. Yet, its legacy is not of innovation or performance. It is a lesson in corporate misjudgment and market timing. The Newport two-door is remembered less as a car and more as a case study on how external factors, fuel prices, shifting buyer expectations, and dealer reluctance can doom a vehicle before it has a chance to prove itself. In conclusion, the 1980 Chrysler Newport two-door was a massive, stylish car released at the worst possible moment. Its size, thirst for fuel, and outdated design collided with a market increasingly dominated by efficiency and practicality. Dealer reluctance and poor sales sealed its fates, leading Chrysler to cancel it mid-year. The Newport two-door exemplifies how even competent engineering cannot save a car that fails to align with its economic and cultural context. Today, it remains a stark reminder that timing, market awareness, and buyer priorities are as crucial to automotive success as horsepower or luxury features.